Hi everyone, welcome to Bonnie Carolee Makes Cards. This card is designed for that special friend who is just so wonderful and thoughtful you never can find enough words to thank them. Simon Says Stamps So Talkative says it all, so I've included just about every sentiment on the card. Using Simon Says Stamps talk bubbles, I stenciled a whole number of speech bubbles that were overlapping one another on Bristol Smooth cardstock. I was working with Distress Oxide ink, spiced marmalade, ripe persimmon, and dried marigold. I had a scrap piece of vellum sitting on my desk, and I typically will grab anything that's handy, and I use that just to mask off any of those speech bubbles that were close to the one that I was stenciling. It does take the Distress Oxide inks quite a while to dry, and so I was very cognizant about this and trying to avoid getting ink on my background. After stenciling each speech bubble, I wiped the ink off with a baby wipe, both at the front and the back of the stencil, and then dried it with a paper towel. My slimline panel, which by the way had been cut using Pink Fresh Studio's second largest die in slim stitched rectangles, was set aside to dry. I prepared a small blend using ripe persimmon and spice marmalade on another piece of Bristol Smooth cardstock that would be used to die cut Simon Says Stamp Friend outline. To avoid getting ink residue on my die, the panel was set aside to dry for a while. The Friend outline die cuts the letters separately, making this a perfect accompaniment to go with Simon Says Stamp's Itty Bitty Tag. I want the banner to have dimension on my card, so the tag was die cut in both white cardstock and white foam. After all the white tags were mounted on foam, my piece of Bristol Smooth cardstock that I had ink blended was dry and it was ready to be die cut. The Friend die was used to not only cut the ink blended panel, but also white cardstock. As the name suggests, when you cut these letters, you're going to have a letter plus an outline. I am going to keep the ink blended one intact and then use just the white letters to stack it. I chose to do this rather than inlay the white letter just to give a little bit more dimension. The tags are threaded onto some silver round cording. The cord just fits through those holes and I was having a hard time threading it. I figured out that if I cut it at an angle, I could get it through easily. As I poked it through, the end would fray and I almost had to cut it off every single time. I wanted to increase the fun factor on this card by adding some detail to each of the speech bubbles. So this is where the double stenciling comes into play. I align the talk bubble stencil with the speech bubble that I'm going to be working on. If this speech bubble is overlapped by another one, I use a little bit of Post-it note to mask it off. The stencil with the pattern is placed on top and it is inked with something darker. I'm using a number of different pattern stencils by Simon Says Stamp and going one shade darker on each of the speech bubbles. So for this session of stenciling, I dropped off my lightest tone, which was the dried marigold, and I added on one deeper, abandoned coral. Each of the patterns were used at least a couple of times in different areas of the panel. On this speech bubble, I'm using a fun confetti stencil. I've also included a paisley, circle, heart, and star design. And I got a spot of ink on the background and my creative detailer lifts that off. So now on to the embossed sentiments, but I do make sure that my panel is completely dry and I test it by putting a little bit of embossing powder on it and making sure that it will tap off cleanly. I'm pretty sure that the sentiments from So Talkative were designed to go with the speech bubbles. It was very easy to match up a sentiment for each one. The sentiments are stamped one at a time. When a speech bubble overlaps the one that I'm working on, I use Post-it note tape to mask it off simply. I first apply anti-static powder and then ink up my stamp with Versamark ink. The Post-it note masks are removed before the white embossing powder is applied. I continue in this manner until all of the speech bubbles have sentiments in them. It doesn't take long at all to emboss all of these sentiments. Some of the speech bubbles do not require any masking, and so that's straightforward. For those that do, the use of pieces of Post-it note tape make it quick and easy. Anti-static powder was applied before I stamped each sentiment. If a bit of the powder strayed, I used a soft paintbrush just to knock that powder off. When melting, the embossing powder, heat is applied to both the front and the back of the panel. This helps minimize warping. So now on to the banner. Because I've used that cording, it does curl a little bit, so I thought I was going to have a little bit of a challenge getting it on. I'm going to hang it in a swag fashion, and so I apply glue to the two outermost letters to get it positioned first. Those tags were held down until that glue set up, which thankfully didn't take long. Once I had all the letters positioned into that nice soft curve, I went ahead and glued the two center letters next. These letters were held in place until the glue dried, and then the last two letters were adhered. The ends of the cord were tacked down following the curve of the swag. Again, I held it in position until that glue set up before I moved on to the other side. The panel was set aside to dry for some time before I snipped off the ends of the cord. The panel was mounted on white sheet foam. Before trimming down the excess foam, I do let the panel dry. When trimming a straight edge of foam, I like to use my large shears. I find that when I use my small scissors, I can get jagged edges. The panel is adhered to a Nina Classic Crest 110-pound card base that measures 3 3/4 inches by 8 3/4 inches. Of course, I have to have some shine, and these clear, sparkly sequins will do the trick. I pop a few here and there in the background, overlapping some of the speech bubbles. Each of the sequins are topped up with Nouveau Crystal Drops Morning Dew. When you can't find enough to say about a dear friend, say it all with Simon Says Stamps So Talkative. I hope you enjoyed today's video featuring the double stenciling technique to make those speech bubbles so much more whimsical and fun. Thank you for visiting, and as always, I appreciate your visit.